We in the Western world really have a decision to make right now. Are we going to be led down the path of another decades long conflict, or perhaps even World War III? Or are we finally going to take some degree of democratic control and exert some real accountability on our policymakers and bring militaristic adventurism to an end once and for all? Because when you look at the current state of the war in Ukraine and what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians, this is a really stark choice. We can either go down the path of continued war and aggression, which we've experimented with for decades now and had continuously disastrous results, or we could for once maybe just try to do something a little bit different. I'm Stuart Hooper. I'm an independent geopolitical analyst here on YouTube and X primarily. Please follow me if you are new to my page. Hit like, it's free and it helps out a lot. I really appreciate all of the support I've been getting here. It means the world. Now let's take a look at the war in Ukraine and what's been going on here over the past week or so. And this, of course, all revolves around this attempt to get this new $60 billion aid package for Ukraine. So we've had the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who came out just a little over a week ago now and said that the West must be prepared for a decades-long confrontation with Russia. Now, he said that what's going on here is that unless the Western world commits to this unprecedented support of Ukraine, this blank check to Ukraine, well, of course, we're going to be in conflict for decades and decades to come. Now, you can see here he specifically talks about decades, but what's most important in this article is this. He says, quote, "We need to restore and expand our industrial base more quickly so that we can increase deliveries to Ukraine and replenish our own stocks." In other words, we need to continue the unrelenting support for the military-industrial complex that has come at the expense of literally everything else in Western societies for decades and decades and decades, but especially the war on terror years. If we don't continue to do that, the world is gonna end. And we had some very interesting headlines along those lines this past week, didn't we? In terms of this Russian space-based nuclear anti-satellite device, whatever the hell this thing is. We're gonna come to that in a second. But importantly, what else happened this week that we could point to here and say, you know what? Maybe, that decades-long conflict that Stoltenberg, that NATO is angling for here, because this is important to keep in mind. NATO needs a decades-long conflict to justify its existence. But, as I said, something really does call this into question. New poll, nearly 70% of Americans want talks to end the war in Ukraine. The survey suggests the Biden administration policy towards Russia is increasingly out of step with public opinion. Now, what really illustrates this fantastically is this post here from Jimmy Dore over on X, where he highlighted this clip from Stephen A. Smith, a very prominent sports commentator in the United States. And he said, quote, "We've got starving people born and raised in this nation. How the hell did we come up with a $53 million pilot program for illegals?" That's the New York program to hand out prepaid debit cards to people that have entered the United States illegally, just like the billions for Ukraine. And Jimmy Dore said, I think perhaps somewhat correctly, we're getting close to a real revolution when guys like this have had it. Now, this is central to everything that I am also currently seeing and experiencing. People, unlike ever before, are starting to question the foreign involvement of the United States, of the United Kingdom. And it's coming from an angle exactly like Stephen A. Smith just said. How come while we have thousands of homeless veterans, thousands of homeless people generally, hundreds of thousands actually in the aggregate in the United States, thousands of people below the poverty line, millions of people below the poverty line, how come we can just all of a sudden magic money out of thin air and just produce it for all of these foreign entanglements? The chickens are coming home to roost. The Western world has allowed itself to decline so dramatically in a domestic sense here at home that people are finally starting to see the writing on the wall. Our future has been sold down the river for all of this foreign adventurism, and we have got a grand total of nothing to show for it, except in this particular case, a destroyed and eviscerated Middle East, the rise of ISIS, everything that's now flaring up, the resurgence of the Taliban, and at home, we've been saddled with literally trillions of dollars in debt. And then COVID and everything that happened with that, and the mass printing of money, the destruction of the money supply, the inflation rate. People are finally putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 4, which for someone that has been involved with studying this and researching these issues for now over a decade is extremely heartening. Finally, people are seeing what's going on here, because this system is completely running out of control. And it also comes down to some practical questions as well here. When we think about Ukraine, and particularly the state of this conflict and the state of this nation. So here we had a former CIA analyst issues a warning to Zelensky. Now, what is this warning? Well, it's specifically due to the fact that what has happened in Ukraine over the past week or so is Zelensky fired the head of the command forces, the allied land forces of Ukraine, the head of the Ukrainian military, essentially, and replaced him with someone else. Now, what is the point that this former analyst makes? Firing the military's senior command in wartime is a sign of failure. It is something that states do when they are losing, not winning. Zelensky's move is fraught with risk. No new commander or tranche of military aid can reverse the difficult truth. Ukraine lacks the manpower, weapons, and economic capacity to sustain a prolonged war of attrition against Russia. But what was NATO just telling us? This can go on for decades, no problem. Just keep signing those blank checks to the military-industrial complex. Everything will work out fine. So on a practical military level, we're looking at inevitable failure. It's undeniable. And what did we see just a couple of days ago? I don't have the article pulled up here. Ukraine had to retreat from a key town, key city in the east because it was about to be encircled by Russian forces. I thought it's also worth bearing in mind the same nation here where we are supposedly fighting for democracy and democratic values, a nation that has historically been at the center of corruption scandals, domestically and internationally, has ruled out holding elections this spring and called for instead unity in fighting Russia. Yes, of course. And here we have the quote here. Now, in wartime, when there are so many challenges, it is absolutely irresponsible to throw the topic of elections into society in a light-hearted and playful way. What is this adding to? The waves of any politically divisive things that must stop. Now is the time of defense, the time of the battle that determines the fate of the state and the people. Not the time of manipulations. So if you want to have an election, that's a manipulation. Do you see how this whole democracy thing works? It's democracy until you start voting for something and supporting something that the people that are really in charge don't want you to do. And then all of a sudden, well, for all of these other reasons, for national unity, for the defense, for the future of the state, we just can't hold an election right now. These people are literally laughing in your face. And to be honest, spitting in all of our faces with all of this. And we've now had the millions of dollars in aid that have gone missing, that have been stolen by Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian commanders. Again, I'm sure you guys have seen that headline by this point. I don't have it pulled up. Go and find it. It won't take you too long. Now, in the West, of course, we've been facing this question of, well, we need this new $60 billion. We need this new blank check. Ukraine needs it, or else it's all going to come to a grinding halt. The world's going to end. Putin's going to take over. The next Hitler, so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. Now, look, I'm no fan of Putin. Could Russia have been a stabilizing force in geopolitics, a counterweight to the United States? Yes, absolutely. I think it showed some elements of that in intervening in Syria, where it essentially said, no, United States, you're not going to support a rebel group that's going to overthrow the state of Syria. We are going to defend the state of Syria. To some extent, that could have been positive, a counterweight to American interventionism in the world. But Russia, of course, did throw out any moral authority that it had when it decided to go ahead and invade Ukraine. So there's no justification for the invasion of Ukraine for the Russians either. They're as in the wrong here as anybody else, as NATO trying to convert Ukraine to this Western powerhouse of military force on Russia's border. That's a disaster. The invasion of Ukraine from Russia is a disaster. None of these factions, none of these people are your friends. Alternative media, you've really got to get a grip on this as well. I mean, some of the lionization of Putin is ridiculous. So what do we have to try to justify this aid package? Again, this aid package is just aid. We're just helping the Ukrainians out. Forget the fact that this is really just a money laundering scheme that filters money through the military industrial complex, increases their share prices, increases the economic and political power of those companies. Forget all that. This is about defending democracy, defending Ukraine. Right. Yeah, of course it is. What did we have go on here? An extremely, I would argue, dangerous turn of events. So this broke a few days back. GOP started warning of a, quote, national security threat about Russia wanting nuclear weapon in space. It would not be to drop a weapon on Earth, but to possibly use on satellites. So this made a big hubbub here, and it's very concerning, very sensitive. It's a big deal. We had Speaker Johnson involved in this, some other key members of Congress making some waves here with some of these issues. And then finally, some of the details finally started to trickle out on this, and people started to figure out, well, what does this mean if Russia has this, and how much of a threat is this? The White House has said the danger isn't imminent, but reports of the new anti-satellite weapon build on long-standing worries about space threats from Russia and China. So much of the country's infrastructure is now dependent on US satellite communications, and those satellites have become increasingly vulnerable. So what we have here is quite a large nugget of truth, in the sense that, yeah, a lot of our lives is dependent on these satellites and their operation and how they work and how they communicate between different places around the world. True. Space-based weapons, also potentially a real significant threat. But who else has been developing space-based weapons for decades and probably has a vast series of black programs directed to the development of space-based weapons? Well, of course, the United States, of course, the Western world, of course, the United States, in concert with the United Kingdom, with Israel, with these sorts of big players in the Western military-industrial complex. So here again, we return to the central issue of all of this: militarism, interventionism, empire, all of this stuff. If you want to call it out as wrong, you probably shouldn't be doing it yourself. Now, that again goes for the United States and at this point, Russia as well, thanks to its invasion. So here's the thing, right? We can now decide Do we want to live in a world where we are going to go ahead and approve these blank checks, which is essentially what a $60 billion aid package is? It's a blank check. It's a huge sum of money. Regardless of how people try to spin this, it's just a drop in the bucket. You know, it's a teeny tiny portion of the overall budget. Do you realize what $60 billion could do for a small town here in small town rural Oklahoma in the United States where I live? I mean, you could turn it from day to night, literally. You could create a space-aged city in the United States for this. But of course, no, we should funnel that money overseas. We shouldn't worry about healthcare for the American people. No, we shouldn't worry about homeless people on the streets. We should just send $60 billion to Ukraine, right? So we can decide, are we going to be a part of this transnational, meaning beyond the state, this transnational military industrial complex, this transnational empire that is really only directed to global political, economic, and military domination? This really is a three-pronged assault that we face. Or we can say no. Enough is enough. Ukraine is losing the war, as evidenced here. Ukraine doesn't stand for democratic values. The people want an end to this. And therefore, that's what we're going to be working towards. If leaders in the Western world want to continue to pretend to play this game that they call democracy, that you get to vote for people and they're your voice and they're going to do what you want them to do, we need to start holding them to account on foreign policy issues. Because for far too long, in the West in particular, people have turned a blind eye to this, waved a flag and said, support the troops, go USA, go United Kingdom, we're on top, we're winning, we're beating the bad guys. It's time to break out of all of this ridiculous, childish notions of what's going on here. Realize that our future is being literally flushed down the drain for these militaristic projects, and tell all of these people in power, unless you stop this, you are not getting re-elected. It's as simple as that. If they want to keep pretending that this is a democracy, well, let's go ahead and keep playing democracy too. Let's keep pretending. Let's keep pretending that there are these other forces that are really pulling the strings, and let's see what they do. Let's try and get a groundswell of people that are willing to say, you are not getting my vote, Republican or Democrat, unless you turn the tide against militarism. This has to end, and it has to end now if you want any real future. Thank you guys for making it to the end here. Remember to subscribe, follow if you are new, hit like on this, really appreciate it, and share it everywhere you possibly can. We need people to understand and realize where we currently are in the world, the current state of things, in the sense of the crumbling nature of our civilization, of our reality in the West, at the expense of all of this foreign interventionism. The more people that we can get to wake up to this, the better. Thanks again for watching. I'll be back with more soon.